he was filled by a false anthropology, he wrote. He would become probably the most impassioned philosophical defender of preexistence in the 20th century. He believed it was the most powerful means of recuperating a dignity that had been denied by Orthodox Christianity. If time permitted, I would talk to you about Wilhelm Benecke and his insight that preexistence is a necessary foundation for any claim to the intuition of spiritual realities. It's a very interesting argument. Essentially, he's referring to the same problem that a transcendent God has always posed. If God is truly ontologically distinct from us, exists outside of human space and time, how can he ever bridge that divide and communicate with us and become a part of human history and layers of being? And similarly, Benecke says, well, he agrees with that critique and says the only way that we could have a recognition of spiritual realities is if we are possessed of a spirit that comes from God's presence. I would talk to you about the transcendentalists' use of preexistence to assert a new kind of authoritative discourse, right? When Emerson and other American transcendentalists move away from traditional bases of authority and normative Christianity, they need nonetheless a way of founding their own authority as secular prophets. And they seem to do this time and time again by invoking this concept of a preexistence from which they themselves and all of us hark. I would talk about Julius Müller, a great 19th century theologian who wrote 2 volumes on the doctrine of sin, arguing that preexistence is the only way to save the concept of human agency. Or we could talk about the modern philosopher John McTaggart, very influential in his theories of temporality and time. And he invokes an argument that really is as old as Aristotle, that whatever is free is accountable, but only that which is cause of itself can be free. And therefore, only if the soul is self-existent and does not come into existence with the body, can you ground the idea of human freedom. But what all of these thinkers have in common is not simple reaffirmation of a truth taught by Joseph Smith in relative nakedness and simplicity, but a very real power to expand and enrich our understanding of what we hold to be an eternal truth, and a stunning witness to the immense variety of theological, cultural, psychological, and philosophical work that the paradigm has been invoked to serve across the centuries. Let me conclude with a few observations on what I think I have learned about the demise of preexistence. One scholar has this to say, modern scholar talking about the early Neoplatonic Christian bishop Synesius, who was an earnest advocate of preexistence. In fact, he agreed to be ordained a bishop only on the condition that he be allowed to maintain intact his affirmation of preexistence. Modern scholar says his affirmation of the inherent divinity, listen carefully to this little argument, Synesius' affirmation of the inherent divinity of the human soul, which makes it possible to return to the divine, is a clear indication of its essentially pagan faith. That's a somewhat astonishing and revealing claim. The best illustration this scholar can cite of his claim that the bishop's belief is pagan is when he quotes the bishop as saying, "The Blessed One who flees the devouring bark of matter and earth rises up and with a leap of the Spirit presses on his path back to God." Surely this sounds as much like any medieval mystic as it suggests a pagan. What then is it that is so threateningly pagan about preexistence and human origination in the divine? The answer was given long ago by the church father Tertullian, when he, like our modern scholar, revealed how drastically the construction of Christianity's God was moving away from Plato's definition of God. In the Timaeus, Plato had written, "God was good, and the good can never have any jealousy of anything." Being free from jealousy, God desired that all things should be like himself. But Tertullian objected to this, saying, "To endow mankind with so large an amount of divine quality is to put it on a par with God. Plato makes it unborn. He then adds that the soul is immortal, incorporeal. Since he believes God to be the same, invisible, incapable of delineation, uniform, supreme, rational, what more could he attribute to the soul if he wanted to call it God? We, however," writes Tertullian, who allow no appendage to God in the sense of equality, by this very fact reckon the soul very far below God. We suppose that it was born. This, then, is how I perceive the demise of pre-existence. This is a summation of a very long and complex history. With a centering of grace in Christian theology, which occurs in the early 5th century, it becomes a specially dispensed gift that precluded most, if not all, human capacity to lift the self. With a focus on sin, inherited guilt, and depravity, in the face especially of the Pelagian heresy, divine sparks to human nature, heavenly antecedents to the human personality were anathema. With creation ex nihilo, which develops only with time, a further necessary precondition of God's sovereignty, pre-existence was increasingly seen as logically incompatible. If the sovereignty of God is defined as him being the source of all existence, then obviously souls cannot coexist with him. The coup de grace, however, occurs when St. Augustine determines that the concomitant to grace is a supra-rational logic beyond the human. The theodicy, right? The attempt to make sense of God's justice that St. Augustine had been so intent on establishing was made to bow to the mysterious workings of God. Rational resolution of the scandal of human pain and misery no longer required our attention or effort. In fact, in post-Augustinian thought, our perplexity in the absence of any logical understanding of God becomes a sign of our abject humility and of God's radically other sovereignty. What this means is that the powerful engine that had persistently urged a resolution of the problem of God's justice has just run out of gas. Human agency, so essential to human guilt, is no longer the desperately sought Holy Grail it once was, now that God's justice resolves itself out of the orbit of human understanding and apologias. For all these reasons, pre-existence lost its most powerful allure. Centuries later, when human possibilities found exuberant expression alongside Neoplatonic resurgence, the idea gained a new foothold in the 17th century. Later again, when the 19th century, the age of reform, was ushered in with a new social conscience and a less powerful and less medieval church, poets and intellectuals again turned to plumb the depths of Faustian yearning, free of all imaginative constraints, and the idea of pre-existence blossomed once more. Finally, let me say this. Noting the Pythagorean belief in pre-existence at the foundations of Western civilization, a Cambridge classical scholar writes this: however many readers believe their soul will survive death, rather few, I imagine, believe that it also pre-existed their birth. The religions that have shaped Western culture are so inhospitable to the idea of pre-existence that you probably reject the thought out of hand, for no good reason. Of course, he then points out slyly, the same Pythagoras that taught the premortality of the soul also taught his followers to spit on their nail and hair clippings, to wash the left foot before the first, and that the sea consists of the tears of Cronus. Well, that may be true. Unfortunately, it misses the point that some beliefs meet a demise as definitive as their implausibility. And yet the critics of pre-existence for hundreds of years have found little to criticize in the doctrine other than its hint of a family resemblance between ourselves and the God who gave us life. I will end with one of those critics whose argument does more to undermine himself than his target. The commentator in the Interpreter's Bible says this: there is something majestic in this conception of a fundamental justice woven into the very web of life, running through all things, working itself out in everything that happens to us. Yet surely it is much too crude and easy a solution. The doctrine of pre-existence has persisted with astonishing tenacity across millennia and culture, a tribute itself, if not to its truth, then to its powerful capacity to satisfy logical, moral, and even aesthetic imperatives of the human heart. Pre-existence, for that reason, may yet have a very bright future. Thank you. And the silence. Okay, thank you.